Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining me because today we are diving into one of the most incredible, highly coordinated mechanical processes in all of nature, plant reproduction. We're talking about the literal journey from a single, microscopic grain of pollen to a fully formed fruit. Now, if you're prepping for your O-level biology exams, this breakdown is exactly what you need to ace it. But even outside of exams, understanding this mechanism is absolutely crucial for grasping how global agriculture and biodiversity actually work.
Okay, let's just get right into it. Today, we're going to hit the basics of plant sex, the exact anatomy of a flower, the whole pollination process, nature's delivery agents, map out a fertilization flowchart, and wrap it all up with some targeted exam prep and a quick recap.
I want to start things off with a pretty wild question. Did you know that just one single pollen grain kicks off this massive, complex journey to form an entire fruit? It's a seriously coordinated, multi-step mechanical operation. And as we trace this timeline from start to finish, pay super close attention to the structures we map out. Because honestly, this biological knowledge, it is the literal engine of our entire global food supply.
All right, Section 1, the basics of plant sex. Let's break down sexual reproduction. So unlike asexual reproduction, which is basically just nature's biological copy machine, sexual reproduction in flowering plants strictly requires two parents. And to actually make this happen, we rely on a mechanical process called meiosis. Meiosis is a specific type of cell division that essentially halves the chromosome number. When that primary cell divides, it creates what we call haploid cells. I really want you to mentally stamp that word onto your memory. Haploid. It just means they carry exactly half the normal genetic payload. Now let's explicitly label these haploid cells. We call them gametes. They're highly specialized sex cells. When a male and a female gamete finally meet and fuse together during fertilization, they restore that full diploid chromosome number to form a zygote. And that fusion, it's exactly what drives the genetic variation that allows species to adapt and survive in changing environments. Moving on to Section 2, the anatomy of a flower and its reproductive structures. Let's start with the outer boundary markers, the petals. You can think of these as the attractors. See, since plants are literally rooted to the ground, they need a structural solution to bring those male and female gametes together. So, using their large surface area, bright, vibrant colors, and very distinct scents, petals basically act as biological landing pads to lure in specific external pollinators. Now let's zoom in on the specific reproductive organs, starting with the male component, the stamen. Notice the part sitting right at the very top? That's the anther. And the anther is the actual physical production site for pollen grains. Whenever you're looking at a stamen on an exam diagram, immediately trace your eyes straight up to that anther, because that is exactly where the male gametes are waiting. Then, smack in the center, we have our female component, the carpel. And this has a very strict three-part vertical structure. At the very top, you've got the stigma, that's the sticky landing zone. Then, tracing a vector downwards, we have this long tube called the style, and finally, right at the base, the ovary. Grasping this exact vertical structure is absolutely key to understanding where fertilization takes place a bit later on. Which brings us to Section 3, the pollination process, and how we actually transfer that pollen. Okay, so we've got our pollen sitting on the anther, right? Well, it needs to get over to the stigma. Pollination is simply the physical transfer vector of that pollen, but how it makes the trip makes a huge difference. Let's contrast the two types. In self-pollination, pollen moves within the exact same plant. That guarantees reproduction, but it severely limits genetic variation. Contrast that with cross-pollination, where pollen literally jumps between completely different plants of the same species. It definitely requires delivery agents to get there, but it massively increases genetic variation. A super common exam mistake is mixing these two up, so always remember, same plant versus different plant. All right, Section 4, nature's delivery agents. Let's look at how flowers adapt their careers. If cross-pollination requires delivery agents, who's actually making the delivery? A really common misconception is that all flowers just rely on insects like bees. But let's look at the structural differences. Wind-pollinated flowers have these tiny petals, exposed anthers, and produce very light aerodynamic pollen designed specifically to catch air currents. Insect-pollinated flowers, on the other hand, have those massive, colorful petals, and their pollen is physically sticky, literally designed to cling to a bee's legs. The plant's physical adaptation always perfectly matches its delivery vector. Section 5, the fertilization flowchart. Let's trace the invisible biological timeline. Okay, so the pollen has successfully landed on the stigma. Now we're zooming into a micro level to trace the exact chronological sequence. Step 1, the pollen grain germinates on a compatible stigma. Step 2, and this is amazing, a tiny structural tunnel called a pollen tube physically grows downwards, right through the style. And this tube is carrying exactly 2 male gametes. Finally, step 3, the tube breaches the ovule down at the bottom, releasing those 2 gametes straight into the ovary. And this kicks off a totally brilliant mechanism that is completely unique to flowering plants. We call it double fertilization. Those 2 male gametes we just tracked, they have 2 very different jobs. The first male gamete fuses with the egg cell, creating our zygote, the actual baby plant. But that second male gamete, it fuses with the central cell to form what's called the endosperm. And the endosperm is basically a packed lunch. It's the nutritional storage that will feed that developing embryo as it grows.
Finally, Section 6, exam prep and our recap. Let's lock this information in.
We have covered some serious mechanical ground today. If an exam asks you to list the advantages of cross-pollination, you need to hit these 3 specific points. Number 1, increased genetic variation, because you're bringing entirely different DNA together. Number 2, hybrid vigor, which essentially means the offspring are generally stronger and healthier. And number 3, adaptability to environmental changes. Definitely make sure you memorize this exact list.
Time for our quick-fire recap. First up, sexual reproduction strictly requires 2 gametes fusing into a zygote. Second, macroflower structures are highly specialized for this process. Third, pollination is the mechanical transfer of pollen to the stigma. Fourth, a flower's physical adaptations strictly match its delivery agent, whether that's wind or an insect. And finally, fertilization requires that structural pollen tube growth. My absolute top tip for you: practice labeling a blank diagram of a flower while reciting this exact sequence out loud. To wrap things up, let's zoom all the way back out for a second and think about the real world. Without the genetic variation driven by this cross-pollination process, how in the world would our global agriculture survive shifting climates, new diseases, or environmental changes? Literally every single fruit, every crop we rely on hinges on the microscopic mechanics of that tiny pollen tube finding its mark. It's mind-blowing when you think about it. Keep analyzing, keep exploring, and I will catch you on the next explainer.